morning, everyone, and welcome to an ALN Academy talk on gender inclusion and the rule of law. I'm very delighted today to be joined by my partner from Tanzania, Shemaine Amin. She's a partner in our corporate department, and she's visiting us for some very important conferences, which she will be telling us about later. My name is Aisha Abdallah. I'm a director of the ALN Academy. The ALN Academy is a charity that promotes the rule of law and sustainable development in Africa. We do this by providing quality legal education and training and capacity building. Today we'll be focusing on Shemaine's journey as a corporate partner and what can be done in the legal sector to improve and facilitate gender inclusion. Thank you. Shemaine, welcome.
Thank you, Aisha. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Could you tell us about how you arrived at your current position? You're a corporate partner, you're the head of A&K Tanzania. How was that journey for you, and maybe explain any challenges you faced?
Sure. And Aisha, since we know each other well, I thought I would surprise you with a bit of a fun fact about me this morning that perhaps you didn't know. But my primary passion actually was theater. So when I was in high school, I was a theater higher level, and my dream always was to go to performing arts school. The second passion was actually to practice medicine.
Oh, wow.
And the third passion, which I didn't know about, was practicing law. And I actually fell into the legal space as a fallback when I was in university. I knew that I wanted to, study something that would be transferable, give me versatility, give me adaptability, and law seemed like the perfect choice. And so I ventured off and, got my law degree. And in terms of, how I've ended up where I am today, I'll give you the shorter version of the story, otherwise we'll be here for quite some time. But I essentially followed my instincts every step of the way. So I took a break from practicing law for about 5 years, and I was very keen to understand how business is transacted, particularly when I came back to Tanzania. And I felt that the best way to do that was to be outside a law firm and to be a client. So during that time, I started a few businesses. I worked in big tobacco for a while. I worked for a large family-owned business in Tanzania. And through all of those experiences, found myself full circle back at A&K about 4 years ago. And it's been an incredible experience leading the firm through the many changes that we've had over the last few years. So that's sort of the long and the short of how I've ended up where I am. And in terms of this being traditionally a very male-dominated field, there are a few things that I think helped me navigate the space better, and I'll mention a few of them to you today. So one is having built a strong professional network. I think that as women, it's incredibly important for us to surround ourselves with people that are in spaces that we're interested in. It helps open doors, it helps create opportunity that we perhaps otherwise wouldn't have had. The second one is seeking out mentors and role models. The challenges that we face in traditionally male-dominated spaces means that we benefit from having a good listening ear, support, guidance, people that can talk to you, and also I think people that can inspire you and remind you of the strength and what you bring to the table, because I think sometimes that can get a little bit lost, when we're in the sort of day-to-day tasks that we're completing. The third one is around developing expertise and showcasing skills. And I realized quite early on that you've got to have that one or two things that you're really good at, and that takes time, practice. You have to really hone it, and that's what you want to be known for. I think in a male-dominated field, as women, as much as we hate to admit it, we do have to work harder. So I think having the depth of that expertise so that you're not written off is incredibly important. And the last one is being confident and assertive. And I know that there are sometimes mixed feelings about women perhaps overcompensating, but I've always believed in directness and being forward, and not necessarily, sometimes you have to be nuanced in a certain situation, but when it comes to knowing what you want, I think it's important to be clear about that, because it increases your odds of finding the success and being able to reach where it is that you want to go. So I'll pause there in case you have any follow-ups.
I'm just intrigued still about how, I hope you're going to tell me how you're incorporating theater into your practice of corporate law, because I feel like that's going to be very interesting for our audience. I mean, everything assists you later in life. There's things you learn from other aspects of your life. Tell me about theatre.
So, in terms of theater, it's a coincidence, I guess, that I ended up practicing law. But really, I see that, the world's a stage.
It
And
is.
in many situations that we find ourselves in where there's an objective, we're trying to secure a certain outcome. And theater for me is really the strategy that goes into playing a certain situation. The tone of your voice, the way in which you present, the way in which you read the room, in theater, the way in which you would read an audience, and take feedback from that and how that drives how you respond. It's a combination of many things, and I think there's room for a lot of creativity, and that excites me because even on the corporate side, when we're working on transactions, and for us as ALN, as you know, it really is about finding solutions for our clients' most complex problems, be those legal problems or non-legal problems. So I think I've managed to find a bit of a hybrid.
I love it. I think, first of all, I'd say that the theatre part has come out very well in today's interview. So, moving along, you're a lawyer like I am, and we are interested in why, gender inclusion is important for rule of law, because we can't really have equality before the law unless, as lawyers, we're also very diverse in who we represent. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would agree with that. I think it has a significant impact on the rule of law in Africa, and the diverse perspectives, experience, insights that we bring to the table play a very key role in getting that balanced and fair decision-making process.
Yes. And so, what do you think we could do better, maybe as a legal fraternity, in terms of promoting gender equality within our industry and maybe even assisting our clients? What could we do?
Sure. So, the first and most obvious one for me is, I think, eliminating systemic barriers. So when we look at some of the structural and cultural barriers that hinder women's progress, we need to be looking at things like recruitment practices, equal pay, right, transparency in promotion. And I'm saying this from a perspective of legal industry and in a corporate, but I think as an industry we have to be very alive to these issues and addressing them, so that we can have that equity and that inclusion. Another one is around creating a supportive work environment. And it links a little bit to my first point, but having embedded policies and practices that allow for consistency in application, removing that gray area, I think is also very important, because sometimes we find that women are subject to arbitrary application of policies in companies, and I think that really can set us back. The third point, Aisha, is around having mentorship programs and sponsorship programs. I think that when we can facilitate and encourage that as an industry, it has a significant cumulative impact on women that are benefiting from those programs and getting the support and the guidance that they need from mentors.
Thank you for raising that, because I wanted to ask you what your personal experiences are with mentorship. Have you had positive or negative experiences?
Sure. It's a great question, because I remember early on in my career, I was very skeptical around mentorship programs. I always felt that it was something that every company said that they did and they would encourage you to do. And I wasn't convinced that there would be a tangible benefit to having a mentor. In hindsight, my learnings have been that we often have more than one mentor. I think that's one of my biggest learnings, because we need different things at different times in our careers, and sometimes at the same time you need different things from different people. So I've actually had the benefit of having multiple mentors. Sometimes somebody in the workplace, other times that it may be a family friend or somebody that I know socially, that has provided me with a different type of support that I need at that time. The second point is around how critical it is to identify what you want out of mentorship, and that's one thing that I would encourage women to consider, especially aspiring lawyers. If you go into mentorship not being clear around the support that you need and what your objectives are, I think sometimes it can be an opportunity wasted.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because I would think that early on in your career, it might be difficult to have clarity as to what you want, especially if it's your first time with a mentor. So I think, do you think the mentor's role is to guide you also in what objectives you should set?
Yeah, I think so. And you know, this is a very subjective process, right? So some people may go into mentorship already having done a self-evaluation and knowing that, okay, here are two areas where I'm struggling, or here's an area where I'm lacking a bit of confidence, or here's an area that I would like to hyper focus on and improve in. And that's an easy situation. On the other hand, as you mentioned, sometimes early on in a career, it can be a really confusing space and it can be overwhelming. So I think mentors also have a role to play in terms of facilitating that conversation in a very open way and not in a leading way, so that the mentee has room to self-evaluate, reflect, you know, and really kind of drill down on what it is that they want to focus on in that mentorship relationship.
And I think the other thing I wanted to ask you, Shemaine, about mentoring, um, have you had male and female mentors? And is it different? The relationships, are they different because of the gender, or is it just because of the individual personality?
Yeah. So in the workspace, I've actually had male mentors, and it touches on an important point, Aisha, in terms of the fact that as women, sometimes I think we often isolate ourselves from male allies. And that's a really important piece if we're going to overcome stereotypes and biases, because you need your male counterparts to understand the challenges that you're facing, or what it is that, you know, your uniqueness, I guess, let's put it that way. So I think having male allies is important. But back to the point around mentorship, I haven't felt too much of a difference in terms of the mentorship I've received, but I would say that from a comfort perspective, it sometimes does feel a little bit easier to communicate certain issues to a woman as opposed to a man. And I think that comes back to this underlying self-consciousness that we may have, that, well, if I raise this issue, will I be judged, or will I be seen as weak? For instance, you know, with a woman, you may think, well, they're more likely to understand because perhaps they've
faced it maybe
in my shoes before.
Yes.
Exactly. So I think there are slight differences, but I do believe that you can have an equally valuable mentorship relationship with a male mentor as you can with a female mentor.
Yes, and I think the point you're making is a good one, which is, in a male-dominated industry, you want to access mentors who are at the top of their game. They're very likely to be male often because of that bias. So there's been a lot of progress made, but I think you would agree with me that there is a way to go before we achieve gender equality, particularly in leadership positions. What is it that organizations can do collectively to improve the situation and allow women to contribute what they can as leaders?
I think the leadership question is an important one. And if we look at some of the factors that contribute to the underrepresentation of women in leadership positions, there are many. But two that I'll mention to you today are, you know, the first one is around stereotypes and biases. I think there are very deep-rooted gender biases that adversely impact the trajectory of women in leadership positions. It limits their access to leadership roles. Everything from biased evaluations to having access to fewer opportunities, and also limited support in career advancement. And that point on limited support touches on the second factor, which I think is particularly important, is around the work-life balance. And you know, you've specifically asked about women in leadership, and what you'll find is that even where you start out with relatively equal proportions of men and women, as you look up the trajectory, you lose most of the women along the way. And there's very valid reasons for why that is. And a lot of times, you know, the woman has the additional responsibilities, you know, and the burdens of the family and everything else that needs to happen outside of the workplace. And where the workplace is not conducive to accommodating those realities, the women drop off along the way. And in terms of the steps that organizations can take to be more inclusive, you know, I just mentioned work-life balance. I think flexible working arrangements, especially after COVID, right? I mean, COVID gave us the tailwinds that we needed to realize that this is completely doable. And I know that there are certain sector-specific or job-specific challenges that may arise, but by and large, if organizations can better accommodate the realities of the balancing that the women in the workplace are doing, I think it will increase the odds of retaining those women so that they can continue to climb up the ranks and take on those leadership positions. The second one is on cultivating a culture of inclusion and embedding that in the policies. And we were speaking about this earlier. Organizations need to have transparent procedures, recruitment, promotion. They need to be consistently applied. And I think those are all aspects that will, allow us to address some of the unconscious biases that exist within organizations. The third one is around providing focused leadership and development. I think we have to look very intentionally at identifying high-performing females and ensuring that they have adequate support in their career advancement. And at the same time, I think there's a responsibility that we have to also support marginalized women. So yes, there are the high-performing women who you want to see through that journey, but then on the other end of the spectrum, where there are women that need that extra support, I think it's important for organizations to be able to identify that and deliver that support, because it will just increase the odds of retention.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about maybe personalizing what you've just said. In your career journey, how have you overcome gender bias and stereotypes? And do you have tips for our audience?
Sure. I have a couple of tips, and it's a combination of some of the points that we've already discussed and one additional one. So one is being confident. As I mentioned, I don't think I can overemphasize how important that is. As women, we shouldn't be letting anybody tell us that we can't do something. We need to be very confident about our self-worth, what we're bringing to the table, and not have a flicker of doubt about that. Second tip is to work hard. There's no substitute for that. There are no shortcuts to success. I think as women, we do carry more of that burden. We do have to overcompensate, and I think we just have to accept that reality. The third one is making sure that we seek out male colleagues as allies. Right? And we were talking about this earlier. I think it's in order to overcome those biases and to overcome those stereotypes, we need to have that proximity and build those relationships with our male colleagues so they understand where we're coming from. And they, I think, play a very key role in helping us and helping our organizations move forward from some of these challenges. The fourth one is finding a mentor. And we talked in depth about the importance of mentorship. I think that's a tip I would definitely give to our listeners today to consider. And the last one, which we haven't spoken about yet, Aisha, is speaking out. And I think as women, we often find ourselves in compromised situations. And I had a very interesting conversation last night with one of our partners, and also a very accomplished partner at an international law firm who's visiting us this week from Dubai. And we were talking about how we toe the line a bit too much. And it was this issue of when we find ourselves in certain situations and our gut instinct tells us that this isn't right. And, I don't think that I should be in this situation, but we'll come up with 10 reasons why it's okay. We'll justify it and we'll toe the line. And then before you know it, a line has completely been crossed. And we were discussing how important it is to set the boundaries so that you can identify when you've reached a point where you do need to speak up. And it ties to an earlier point we discussed around the role that organizations need to play. I think that until we reach a point where organizations can create a safe space for people like you and me to feel comfortable to say that, hang on a second, we need to talk about something, the problem will not go away. So I think we do need to speak up. And by not speaking up, I think we are not only setting ourselves back, I think we're setting back the path for our fellow women. So I think we need to remember that sometimes, where we may feel that I don't want to speak up for me. I think that the question for us as women is, by not speaking up, what precedent am I creating? And I think that really is the heart of why it's so important for us to find that voice in those difficult situations, because we have the ability to move mountains if we all do this together.
But then I think your last point is something that's coming through clearly, which is that you need courage. You need courage to aspire to leadership, because it requires courage to speak up. And I would think that if you feel isolated, the last thing you want to do is put yourself out there on an issue that you think is controversial. You're more likely to play it safe. And I think what you're saying is leaders don't play safe. Leaders do what is right. Is that fair? Or?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And they always say that we must lead by example. And these are issues that affect people across race, across age, and to be quite frank, across gender. I mean, yes, today we're talking about gender inclusion from a female perspective, but we also have the male perspective. And we know that these are issues that transcend across people of all demographies and backgrounds. So we have a really, really big role to play. And the courage point, just to unpack that a little bit, is as women, self-doubt is the biggest issue, I think, because we doubt ourselves. There are studies on this, right? A job application comes out, yes, and men will look at it, and even though they may not meet the criteria, will apply, go in, and they'll throw their hat in the ring. Women will look at it and say, oh, but it says 5 years of experience. Now I only have 4.5, so I don't think I can apply for that. And that self-doubt.
They take themselves out.
Absolutely. We pre-screen.
Yes.
We pre-filter.
We
have already decided that we're probably not going to get something, and so we don't even try. And I think that is one of the biggest setbacks. And that comes back to the point around courage. It comes back to confidence. It comes back to how do we find that ability to be bold, appreciating that what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You won't get the job. Or you won't
probably stay where you are.
Exactly. And the saying is quite simple. If you don't ask, you don't get. And I think as women, we don't take enough, I feel, command of the conversation around what we need. And this is, in a workplace, I think, extremely important. We'll internally percolate and think that I think I'm undervalued. I think I should be paid more. I think I need a role change. I think I need an assistant, right? I think I need this. But we'll very rarely go out and find the right person to sit down and say, look, I've been doing some thinking, and here are the 3 tools that I need you to provide me with to set me up for success. And I think when we start having that conversation directly, we are more, inclined to get it. And at least if somebody comes to you and says, well, look, I can't give you all 3, but here are the things I can offer you, we're still further along than we were before we had that conversation. So I think taking command and articulating what we need, and not assuming that the organization or your counterparts know what you need. And I think as women, sometimes we are a little bit guilty of thinking that people are reading our minds, right? But we're not saying it. And that really sits with us.
It's probably because as women, we are good at mind reading. So we think others
are equally reading our minds.
Exactly. Yeah. But it does mean that you probably have to come out of your shell. And it does sound to me like becoming a leader requires you to perhaps dispense with some of the aspects of your personality that don't quite fit the corporate culture. So if you're shy of asking, you won't get as far ahead as maybe a male colleague who normally will demand, not even ask, but demand certain rights. Is that all right as a woman? Or
yeah, no, and you raise a good point, Aisha. And I think the way that I would look at it is we all want different things in life. And if we're talking about a woman that, for example, wants let's take an example of a C-suite leadership position. I think the starting point is to ask yourself what that job entails and demands. What does it require to be successful in that role? And you find that, we are all capable of being molded. And I think adaptability and versatility, as much as we do it, in terms of our work, when we take our legal work, for example, in our hard skills, we do adapt and we do learn and we make it fit here and fit there. I think it's the same for the soft skills. And I think that as a leader, it's not always consistent. It's not one frequency. So if you can appreciate that this role is going to demand the following from me, which may include times where I have to go outside of my comfort zone and take a position on something that perhaps I otherwise wouldn't have done, or to have a difficult conversation, I think that if we're not ready to accept that we need to adapt, then I think it becomes really hard to fill those roles and to fill them successfully. So I think you may be able to fill them, but then the question is how successfully are you filling them? So I think we do need to work backwards from what the role entails, look at our natural inclinations. We all lean a certain way, right? Like you said, some of us would be like a little bit more reserved in some situations, a little bit more outspoken in others. But we have to gauge the demands of the job and then say, all right, in this situation, I need to push myself. I need to bring out a little bit more of this in my personality, whereas my natural inclination would have been perhaps to give less of that and more of something else.
Yeah.
So I think it's very situation specific, but doable is really my key point.
I think it's doable if, one of the points you made earlier is self-evaluation. You can do this only if you understand yourself. If you don't understand yourself, it would be probably hard to work on the aspects you need to bring out.
Yeah, you're right. And on that point, there are a lot of tools available, for self-evaluation, for instance. I mean, I've done a few amazing psychometric tests just in the course of the last year, actually through Strathmore Business School, which gave me a lot of insight into how I operate, where my natural inclination is, how I make decisions, how I communicate with others, how I respond in times of crisis and stress. So I think those tools are extremely helpful for us as women to consider, looking at how are we responding, but also I think we don't solicit enough feedback. I know it's something that I haven't done much of, and it's something that I aspire to do more of, but it's to just find out from people that I'm working with. That can sometimes just be internal, not always external if you don't have access to do that, but just to get a sense of how are people reading you. In terms of how you respond, and I think that gives us another dimension to that self-evaluation, because we're hearing it from colleagues and people that are working with us on a day-to-day basis, and it can open our eyes to strengths that perhaps we didn't know we had, or areas of improvement that can be flagged, and someone says, well, hey, I kind of noticed this, like when you're in this situation you tend to respond this way, and you may become more alive to something that you wouldn't have otherwise noticed or thought of. Exactly.
So I think I'm going to add another tip of yours, because I think the sixth one you're saying is you're investing in yourself. You mentioned Strathmore Business School. You are investing in yourself because you believe in yourself. And if you don't believe in yourself, who else will? Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, great. So now I'd like to turn to work-life balance, something you've touched on a few times. It's extremely difficult striking a balance. We play multiple roles. We spend a lot of time at work, but we have a lot of demands as well outside of work. What would you say to women who are facing these issues on a daily basis? What can they do to manage these competing responsibilities, which I wouldn't like to say they're less important as work. They may be more important, but there's a give and take. How do you address this yourself?
Sure. The biggest realization for me is that it's all in the mind, and we control our minds. So I think that we have full control over how we feel about work-life balance, and I think the emotions around work-life balance are probably what cause women the most anxiety and the most stress, because we beat ourselves up over it. You have good days and you have not so good days, and you forget the good days. When you've had a not so good day and you haven't really balanced that well, we're not kind to ourselves. And I think we're also sometimes a bit unrealistic in terms of, we can't be everywhere all the time 100%. So I think controlling how we view it and our emotions, I think, is a big piece, because then that emotional undercurrent can also affect some of the decisions that we make. So I think having clarity around that. The second one is flexibility. There's no formula. So I think when we're creatures of routine, which I'm a creature of routine, sometimes we can get, when schedule gets turned on its head, it completely
throws you off.
Completely throws you off. And with the work-life balance, I think the flexibility point, I say it from literally a day-to-day perspective. It's a dynamic situation. There are going to be days where your priorities may be, today it's my child, for example. I may have something going on and I've committed 3 o'clock, I need to be there. The next day it may be a work thing, or there may be a week where it's a work thing or a family thing. And I think we have to look at it as a moving target. I look at it day to day. I wake up every day and I know, okay, this is what I must get done today. And then I also ask myself that from the list of things that I say I must get done, do I really need to get all of those things done? Because sometimes we say, well, all of this has to be done. You take a second look and you say, well, actually, I could delegate this. Delegation is another big one, I think, to getting work-life balance, right? I mean, I call it, it's my octopus phenomenon, and I'm talking to some of my associates about this in Tanzania at the moment, and I say to them, look, you have two hands, right? If you were doing everything yourself, how much could you move in a finite period of time? But if you considered yourself to have an extension of 8 tentacles, you could move 8 things simultaneously. Yes, you're not moving them the way you would move them, but the point is that they're moving. So I think having the ability to learn to delegate as women, I think, is also important. Sometimes we can be, do a little bit of micromanaging and, want to kind of handle it ourselves because we know that if I do it, I'll do it this way.
You'll do it properly, maybe.
Exactly. Or you'll do it your way. But it ties to the point around the fact that then maybe the cumulative demands are unrealistic. So if you did want to, if you did want to leave work, for instance, to make it to school to pick up your kid and surprise them, just a random Tuesday afternoon, and you say, I want to be there at 3 o'clock. You could do that, but you'd have to make some shifts, right? You've got to move some things around.
You would.
And I think the last tip would be around setting boundaries and making time for ourselves. I think mental health and physical health are really, really important. And because of our demands as mothers and, having senior positions in the workplace, we sometimes get in the rat race. So you become a taskmaster and you're just moving and you're super efficient, right? And I always say this, like, women are highly efficient. And I feel that women, you have to be. And I feel that women that have children, I was saying this to somebody last week, in some organizations, you come back to work after having kids, and there is a perception among some people that you've come back with baggage, that you're going to be a bit slower. This person has young children now, right? They may be less motivated, or simply they won't cope. And I think it's a huge misconception, because I think women, especially women that are mothers, they are highly efficient out of a place of necessity.
They have to be. Yes.
You have to be. And I think there's nothing more powerful than that, because you've got the same amount of hours.
To do so much.
But you still have to get it all done, right? I mean, you're not going to turn around and say, well, yeah, I'm just going to not do these 5 things. They need to happen. So, I think that knowing our boundaries as women, knowing, when enough is enough, when do we need to say no? Are we really just taking on too much and setting ourselves up for failure? I think being alive to that is equally important. And taking care of ourselves, because, it's like vacation and leave. Nobody tells you to go on leave.
No, they won't, especially if you're very efficient at work.
You need to be the one, right?
Yeah.
That acknowledges that my body and my mind need these things.
Yes.
And I'm going to make the time for that. So I think the rat race for us creates a risk of burnout and just moving through the motions. And the next thing you know, you mentally you're not there, and physically it takes a toll on you.
Yeah.
So.
And I think if we didn't learn it during COVID, the importance of looking after ourselves. Yeah. It's a shame, because COVID showed us what we should be prioritizing. I think a lot of what you said sounds like you're very good at prioritizing on a particular day what is actually topmost, and not maybe another thing maybe that you said indirectly is being careful not to allow other people to set your priorities. How do you manage that with clients? Because clients will often not care about your personal circumstances and just want something done by a certain time.
Sure. So I think in terms of managing those priorities, when, let's say, 3 things need to be done by end of day, and there's no option, they have to get done, you have to ask for help. And that for me is what's helped me the most. Is, there was a time where I felt that I had these 3 things on my table, which meant that I needed to handle those 3 things. It's a key transition in the leadership spectrum, because, as you go into positions of leadership, to really be an effective leader, you cannot be doing it all yourself. No. You need to have people around you. You have to have capacity that you're building. You have to be creating opportunities for others to train, etc. And you need to be delegating. So when I have competing priorities in that situation where I can't move something and it absolutely has to be done, I solicit help. And where help is not available, which sometimes happens, I mean, you just might not get help, then I think that you've got to weigh the pros and cons of the situation you're in. Do you do it the best that you can do it and just get it out? Caution your client. Do you send something out in a draft form, or do you speak to maybe one of those 3 clients and say, look, we're in this situation. Is it possible for us to give this to you tomorrow? And again, if you don't ask, you don't know.
If you don't ask, you might not get.
Exactly.
Do you find clients are flexible? You're a corporate partner, so my perception from disputes is that corporate clients are fairly demanding. Is that fair, or does it depend on each client?
I think it is client specific. I think it's also situation specific. So it's really important for us as the lawyers to have a good read on the situation. If you know that there is something really critical going on, and if you go in and ask for an extension, it's probably not going to go down well. But if you are in a situation where you think that there may be a bit of room, then I think it'll turn on the relationship. And that's where the lawyer-client relationship is so important, because the more you know somebody, right, you're depositing in the emotional bank.
Yes.
So then, if you're consistently delivering, and it's once in a while that you step in and say, hey, look, I kind of need a hand with this today. I always give the benefit of the doubt to my clients that they're also reasonable people. They're business people at the end of the day. And I think you'll be surprised where you've generally done a good job, where people just come out and support you and say, hey, you know what? Actually, we don't really need this today.
Or we could do it in a different format, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps, exactly. Or we could have a call or do this or do that. But I think that's a privilege that you earn with time when you have that relationship with the client.
And I think one of the things you're saying is that you need that good track record, the performance in the past where you've come through for your clients, because when you've done that consistently, they are going to want to still use you.
Exactly.
And give you the leeway you need.
And that's what they know you for, right? So it becomes an exception and not the rule.
Right.
And I think that's the key thing, right? The one time that you need it, people will remember, but consistently, I know that if I've given Aisha something, it will be delivered to me on time. So you know what, I'm happy to give her some space here, because something genuine must have come up, because this is not a typical pattern of behavior.
Yes. So we have clients. We've been talking a lot about external clients. What about your internal client relationships? You will probably have colleagues who are coming to you for advice. Do you find they are accommodating? How do you encourage them to accommodate some of your needs?
So do you mean from a...
So I'll give you an example. It might be that I, as a client of yours from Kenya, need some corporate M&A advice from you in Tanzania for one of my Kenya clients. So we have an external client, but I would be making the request. And in that sense, I'm an internal client of yours. I may not be aware of your schedule, say, for next week when you're back in Tanzania, and I might have just promised without discussing with you that you would be able to deliver this to my client by Wednesday, maybe not knowing anything about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for you.
Right.
How would you manage that internally?
Yeah. So I think in that situation, in hindsight, of course, the communication is key, right?
Yes.
So I think we can preempt the situation where we've aligned and made sure that the timelines
It would have been better if I checked. I agree.
Exactly. Timelines work for everybody. But no, when you are in that situation, I think that when we look at our internal clients, they are equally as important as our external clients, because ultimately we are delivering together, right? So I think that we stand everything to gain, but we also stand everything to lose if we don't back each other up. So from a prioritization perspective, again, I think it would just be looking at, the commitment that's been made, seeing if we need to solicit more support. Do we need to get more people on the file? For instance, if I'm tied up, do we need somebody else to step in? And then just kind of managing that process to see what we can deliver as promised, and where we have flexibility to build that in. But I think that the key point for me, Aisha, is that the clients, your internal stakeholders that are at the center of your processes are just as important as the external stakeholders.
And I think the other point you made is it's all down to communication, because a lot of the issues of work-life balance is either poor communication, or the communication is okay, but it's come too late. It's come late and you've planned your week.
Yes.
And a commitment has been.
Yeah, the timely communication point, I think, is critical. And it's something that I discuss with my associates all the time. And I tell them that you can't over-communicate.
No, you can't.
When in doubt, you just communicate. Because by communicating, you're equipping somebody with enough information to make an informed decision. And I think that when we don't communicate, by withholding that, we're denying them of the privilege to have the information that they need to make a judgment call. So I think the onus really is on us to keep people, updated. When things are going on track, important to keep people updated so that they don't fill in the blanks and assume, that it's not. But also, yes, particularly when things perhaps are not going on track, preempting that as early as possible then allows you to strategize and build a plan and a solution around that so that you can just mitigate the consequences.
Yeah, thank you. So, we've had quite a wide-ranging discussion, and I think I would say the issues you've raised affect men and women in many ways. Communication skills, mentoring, having sort of the ability for flexible working. All of these would be things that both men and women would want. Do you have any parting shot for our audience? Anything you want to say to round up?
I think to round up, I'll give the parting words probably to the women that are out there listening today, and it's really to lean in to being a woman. I think that we sometimes forget that it's one of our greatest assets and one of our greatest strengths, and until we can embrace that uniqueness, I don't think that we can realize our true potential. And as much as society, stereotypes, biases, it may feel that all of that is working against us, I think we know deep down the value that we bring, the value of our perspective and the insights just by virtue of our biology, our experiences, right? It's a very multifaceted concept. And I would just encourage women to not shy away from that and not be in denial about it and not try to hide it.
So embracing it.
Absolutely. Like embrace it fully and lean into the fact that you're a woman and find strength from that and leverage it outwards, because it's an incredible differentiator and an asset for us.
It's been truly a pleasure, Shemaine. I think we'll have you back next year to give us a 2.0 version, gender inclusion. But thank you so much for your time this morning. And thank you as well to our audience. And I hope you'll join us again for more of our ALN Academy talks. Thank you.